Did everyone get their ghost name? I'm a mysterious spirit. I did one of these and the woman was unfortunately a haunted haunt, so she didn't get a very original one. So as I said, I'm Sara Kaushal. My most recent book published was Dayton Ghosts and Legends. You can find me on Facebook. I have Sara Kaushal-author and also sarakaushal.com. If you just remember my name and how to spell it, it'll help you find my websites. We're going to tell a ghost story today. This is the ghost of Mad Anthony Wayne. Technically, this is a Pennsylvania ghost story, and I had already reached my word count for Ghosts and Legends, so it did not get included in the book. So let's talk for a minute about who was Mad Anthony Wayne. He served as an officer in the Army during the Revolutionary War. There's a few different theories about why he was called Mad, one of which is his rivalry with James Wilkinson. They were both up for the same job, and Wilkinson went on a smear campaign saying that he was crazy. You know, that Anthony Wayne, he's such a crazy guy. So he was called Mad because of that. The other theory is just he had so many crazy military antics that maybe they had called him that just because of how he behaved during the war. He lends his name to Bruce Wayne, Wayne Avenue, Wayne High School. If you hear the word Wayne around here, it's most likely from Anthony Wayne. You can kind of tell Revolutionary War names. It was somewhat of a friendship club. They all named stuff after each other. Jefferson, Washington, Wayne, Wilkinson, St. Clair, Ludlow. These men they all knew each other. So Anthony Wayne died of a gout flare in 1796. He was about 45. He was buried in Erie, Pennsylvania. If you're familiar with Erie, it's kind of in the top left corner of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania looks mostly like a rectangle. It took about 12 years for the family to decide, you know what? I don't like that he's buried up there when we have a family plot down here in Radnor. Radnor is on pretty much the opposite corner of Pennsylvania, so mostly in the right-hand lower side. They sat together and they talked, and they decided that the grown son, Isaac, was going to rent a cart and bring his father back, and then they would bury him in the family plot. However, Isaac rented a sulky. A sulky is a two-wheeled cart that's dragged by a mule or a horse, and there's really not much room in there. It's room for maybe one person to sit, and then there might be enough room for a trunk or a small package or suitcase, but it's really not big enough to be able to take an entire body. When they get up to this burial site right here, this is actually where he was originally buried, inside of that. They disinterred him, and he was so well preserved, he looked like he was fresh. He had a little bit of a chalky complexion, and one leg had decayed partially, but other than that, he looked as if he had died just that week. So there was a dilemma. Dr. Wallace, who was local to the area, he was also the attending physician when Wayne died. He suggested, let's dismember him, boil him, and then take the bones. So they made the most disgusting soup you can imagine and then dumped all the liquid back into the original grave, taking only the bones with them to Radnor. As you can see from a picture, this is what a sulky looks like on the right. It is just a small little cart. They loaded his bones in the cart loosely, not even a bag, not a box, just kind of piled them in. They traveled over 400 miles on dirt and gravel roads to Radnor, Pennsylvania, Highway 32. When they got to Radnor, there was less than half a skeleton left. So now every year on his birthday, which is New Year's, Anthony Wayne is seen, similar to this, riding along Highway 322 in search for the rest of his bones. I'm probably really mad at Isaac. So let's talk about some haunted places in the Dayton area. First, we have Library Park. This is one of my favorite stories just because it's utter chaos. This is located in Miamisburg, and if you're familiar with the Miamisburg Historical Society, it's right there. It's right next door to it. You can look out the window and see the spot. This used to be a cemetery, and the cemetery, they had decided they wanted to move it down the street to where Hillgrove Cemetery is now. And so they sent out notice to the relatives, and everyone in the city knew about this, but people were kind of dragging their feet. This had started in 1864, And for 20 years, people were just, I'll get around to it eventually. I'll move my aunt, my cousin, my mother, whatever, down the road. It wasn't really a priority for anybody. But then one night, a young woman appeared, a ghost. She was all in white, walking with her hands clasped behind her back, her head down, and she appeared every single night at 9. Nothing would faze her. People tried talking to her. They tried yelling at her. They tried to walk in front of her just to kind of see if it would interrupt her path. Nothing worked. She appeared every single night at 9 p.m. on the dot. She was so punctual that people could actually set their watch by her. People from other cities and states came to see this, and it was really disruptive to residents of Miamisburg. And they finally got to a point where they had enough. Not only was this disturbing them, but so were the out-of-town guests that were here every single night. This is an actual excerpt from a newspaper in 1884. There were several newspapers that carried the same story. It basically says that there was a riot, and several hundred people, residents of Miamisburg, used weapons. They attempted to throw rocks, stones. They tried to shoot her. They tried to stab her, kick her, hit her. Nothing worked. She just kept walking as if nothing fazed her. The next morning, the entire town turned out and disinterred all the bodies in the original cemetery and moved them down to Hillgrove. The woman in white started to fade after that. The last reported sighting was sometime in the 1960s, but then before that, it was right around 1896. McGee Park. If you're familiar with Bellbrook, you'd probably know McGee Park. The thing about McGee Park is location, location, location. McGee Park has more hauntings than probably anywhere I could know offhand. It is located in what Chris Woodyard calls Ohio's Sleepy Hollow. One story is a woman and her baby. A woman had an affair with her boss, who was considered to be either a politician or someone important in the area. The stories vary on that part. He's having an affair with her. He's married to someone else. She gets pregnant, so he kicks her out. She spends her entire pregnancy just wandering around, trying to find work, trying to find a way to support herself and her coming baby. And after the baby's born, it was said that the baby resembled the father so much that she would just cover its face all day. She didn't want anyone to see. In a moment of desperation, she goes to his house and she tries to get him to come to the door. She's thinking, if he sees me, if he sees this baby and sees how much the baby looks like him, he'll have no choice. He'll absolutely support me. Instead, he had the servant who answered the door slam it in her face. She was so heartbroken that she went to the river, which was significantly higher than it is now, and she jumped in with the baby. She was found a week later, but the baby was not. So some wonder if there actually was a baby to begin with. Some wonder if the baby was found and taken care of by somebody else. There's not a year on this, but there actually was a story in the Bellbrook Moon where a baby had been left on a porch. And there was guesses as to who could have been the parents of that baby. But since this doesn't have a date on it, it's hard to say. But there's talk of a ghostly woman who sings to a bundle held in her arms. Sometimes people say they see a woman or they hear crying. Other times they think they hear a lullaby flowing in the wind. There's John Buckley, who was a miller, and he was murdered. There were stories in the paper about they walked over to church, and then as they came back, they just saw him lying in the street. Well, he had been murdered, and they took him to his house. They didn't know what to do with him. They eventually buried him. And after that, they basically ransacked his house, trying to find a treasure that they thought was buried in his basement. Years went by. Finally, they got some people to rent the house. They had to go outside of Bellbrook. Nobody in Bellbrook would stay there, so they started renting out to people from Dayton. They report ghostly sounds, and the woman claims she even saw the man with his head cut open, blood, the whole deal. And they left that very day. She refused to go back into the house, even for her things. Somebody else had to do it. But then the next tenant who rented the place found rats in the attic. He cleaned that up, he got rid of the rats, and he reported no disturbances after that. McGee Park is also considered to be the site of a few Bigfoot sightings. There was a story from the 1800s where a unicorn was spotted while these boys were walking around after church. They ran back to the town to try and get somebody to come see, but by the time others came, the unicorn was gone. And those boys spent every Sunday afternoon looking for a very long time. Fifth and Ludlow. Now, Fifth and Ludlow is actually the site of the very first cemetery in Dayton, right where the parking lot is, if you ever go down that way. So that parking lot has been a few different buildings over time. It's the south side of 5th Street between Ludlow and Wilkinson. That parking lot's kind of the main spot of it right now. It was very poorly exhumed, as many were in the day. They would send out notes and telegrams, postcards, the like. And a lot of people would come and just move the gravestone and leave the body behind because it was expensive. It was a lot of work. And if you've ever done any research on history or family genealogy, anything of that time period, you know how bad some of the records are. Some people were buried and nothing was ever written down. So some of the people just never were even notified to move somebody. Spaghetti Warehouse, which is just half a block away from this, they've experienced dishes being thrown on the floor, hearing whispers, having customers sit at tables and then disappear. There was a gentleman at one of my talks that actually came up to me afterward, and he said, all of those things have happened to me. He said, when I'd be doing my side work, rolling up silverware, I'd hear someone just whisper, Robert, Robert. And when he looked, there was no one around. Or they'd often see people out of the corner of their eyes. He swore he knew exactly what I was talking about when I mentioned those things. Now, Forney Road, this is in Jefferson Township. It's a long, winding road, and there's a cemetery in one of the bends. So, of course, where there's a cemetery, there's always stories of hauntings. But the more prominent one is a young man who had a car accident on the road. Unfortunately, he died. But they say if you stop your car anywhere on the road, his headlights will appear and they'll just chase you until you turn off the road. Once you turn off the road, you're gone. You're fine. And then there is a story about the Hook Man, the Lover's Lane type stories where, somebody goes parking and then a crazy man with a hook comes and murders or attempts to murder them. That's a very common story from that time period. So the Ridge Avenue Bridge, it's over by Boonshoft, if you're familiar. Bessie Little, who's pictured in the middle, she was murdered on that bridge by her boyfriend. And you'll see in the bottom left that depiction. Bessie thought she was pregnant, and she told her boyfriend. And this was a big scandal back in 1896, Victorian Dayton. So she was trying to pressure him to marry her before she started showing that she was pregnant. Well, Albert had another girlfriend, and Miss Molly Cart was a higher social status and had more money, and his father approved. So Albert was kind of in a bind, not to excuse any of his behavior, but he was feeling the pressure. Bessie threatened to press legal charges on him for paternity or maybe agreeing to marry her and then not. It's a little unclear at that point. So Albert was very stressed out. He eventually shoots her twice in the head and throws her body over the bridge. During the trial, I'd say Bessie was disrespected a lot. The picture in the middle is her head in a jar. So Bessie was buried 4 times. They buried her. They said, oh, she was found in the river. She jumped. She was probably pregnant and just, killed herself, drowned in the river. Didn't even bother to look at her. Buried her. They had to disinter her just to identify her the next day. Then they buried her again. Then they decided they needed to do another autopsy, and they dug her up again, decapitated her, put her head in a jar, and reburied her body. After the trial, they dug her up again to reunite her head and her body. So as you can imagine, being disrespected that much, she's likely still haunting the place. So they say at the bridge, sometimes at night, you can see a ghostly image of a woman, or you may hear a splash or a scream, or even just the sound of gunshots. People don't report it as much anymore. The bridge was replaced in, I believe, 2012, and most of the sightings disappeared after that. So I don't know if there was some connection to that before. Stivers. As the story goes, Mary Tyler was a teacher, and she was found with her neck broken, floating face down in the pool. She had a locket around her neck, and it had 2 pictures in it. One was a picture of her parents, and the other was a picture of a man, but the head of the man had been torn off in the picture, so you couldn't identify who it was. There was talk of Mary having an affair with a senior student at the time, and the day that she was found, he disappeared. Nobody ever saw him again. Witnesses have seen her floating around where the pool was. They built a classroom over it now, and sometimes the kids in the classroom, even in the middle of summer or the hot months, they still have to wear a coat in the class because it's just so cold. Now, Sinclair, a lot of people are familiar with Sinclair. Blair Hall is considered to have the most activity. They've been pulled on, tugged on, poked. You can hear talking and laughing as if they're just people in the room having a conversation. A lot of people have said they see people in the corner of their eye, and when they go to look, nobody's there. The cafeteria actually, despite the fact that it was the old hanging field, it doesn't have a lot of activity. They have these heavy fire doors that have been seen moving by themselves, but other than that, there's not really a lot of reports from that area. Mr. Joshua in Building 13. This was in Haunted, Ohio. There's a ghost of a man who they believe he got his arm caught in the printing press from before it was Building 13. And they believe he died there and he's just stuck. There's a story of security coming to escort an older man out because they kept telling him, like, sir, this building's closed, and he just kept walking around. So they say that Dayton police got involved. This may be a rumor, may not, but that they got involved and that they followed this man, and then they got him into a corner and they're just trying to talk to him, trying to explain, like, you need to leave, trying to get him to respond in some way, and that he just walked right through the wall. There's also the story of a security chief who came to work for a few months after he died. He died in a fire, and then for 2 to 3 months after he died, they'd see him get off the elevator, walk to his office, and then they may not see him the rest of the day. After this happened for a while, the employees got together and they started talking and comparing notes, and they realized he was giving special messages to each of his employees. And then once the last employee got a special conversation message from him, he was never seen again. So maybe he just wanted to close some business. So Ye Old Trail Tavern in Yellow Springs. I've not been there yet, but I've heard it's very good. So what I love about this story is it's kind of a happy ghost and a sad ghost. There are many versions, some of which are not exactly like this, but this is the version I've heard the most. So Mrs. Hafner was married to Francis Hafner, and she and her husband ran this tavern until they both died. She tends to wear her hair in a bun. She looks more blue, like more blue clothing, and she's a happy ghost. The one difference is if you mock the ghosts or the hauntings, she will pull some rather mischievous pranks. There's a story of a man who, back in the 90s when people could smoke in restaurants, a man who was smoking a cigarette and just said that he didn't believe the ghost was real, and she broke the ashtray in front of him, and it was one of those really thick crystal glass-looking ones. The upstairs ghost is said to be her daughter-in-law. So Mr. and Mrs. Hafner had a son who was not a really good character, and he was very interested in this young lady, but she was not having it. She had a love, she was going to get married to him, but unfortunately he had to go away to war first, Civil War. And while he was away, she kept turning down these marriage proposals. I'm not interested, I have a love, once he comes back from war, we're getting married. So he intended to trick her, and he intercepted all her mail. So she thought her love died in the war, and she ended up in a fit of despondency marrying, this older man. A few years later, after she was married, he came back from war, and he was asking, why didn't you write to me? Why didn't you respond to any of my letters? What happened? And so when she found out, she was heartbroken, but divorce was not really an option back then, so she was sort of just waiting for him to die. He was 25 years older, so she was kind of just waiting it out. Okay, I'll marry him afterward. I'll live the rest of my life with my true love. Unfortunately, in her husband's will, he stipulated that she could not receive a single penny if she married again. And she was not in a financial position to be able to turn that down. So she had to take the money, she had to take the terms, and she wasn't able to marry her love. So they think she's trapped there just in sorrow. So when people go upstairs, they kind of feel this overwhelming loneliness and sadness. I want to go there sometime and check that out. So the Amber Rose, I love the Amber Rose. I've only been there once, but it's delicious. It was formerly a grocery store, and it was owned by Sigmund Czesopolski. It was a Polish grocery store. It's also kind of the gathering place for the community. Mostly Polish, but some people just that lived in the neighborhood. It was a social place. And the daughter of the owner, her name was Genevieve. She was born the year that this house was built, and she lived there her entire life. Genevieve did not marry. She did not move out. She did not get a job outside of the house. All she wanted was to stay inside the house. She loved it so much. She spent a lot of time upstairs, you can kind of see here, but in the attic, it was a play area when she was a young girl. Employees have seen a lot of a woman with long black hair. So some people say they see a young girl, some people say maybe a young woman, teenage, and other people say they've seen an older woman. So maybe she's appearing as different phases of her life. But a lot of people say there's windows in the back from the attic when they close up at night, or even some of the neighbors who live around this area, they just see someone looking out of the window with like long black hair from usually the third floor. She has kind of a mischievous side too. She likes to do a lot of pranks. There was a man in the kitchen just washing dishes, and she walks in and she was wearing a very long ankle-length dress. She just lifted the bottom of her skirt up just 3-4 inches, not enough to show anything, but just enough to be noticed. And then she dropped it, and then she just walked away. So I think she's just messing with him. I can't think of anything significant that would mean, but I think she just wanted to confuse him. So I have a friend who works at the Amber Rose and has for the last 20 years. And these are some pictures they've gotten from a night where they were doing a little bit of ghost hunting. So hopefully you can see it. The quality of the pictures is not great. These were taken with a film camera. Then she took them with her camera, and then she sent them to me on Facebook, and then I got them. So there's a lot of degrading of the photos. But you can see in the first one, it kind of looks like a face. And then the second one right here, just in the middle, there are no humans in these pictures, no living humans. So there's no reflections of anybody. This one tends to be hard to see on camera, but it looks a little bit like a face. And some people think that looks like an arm down there, that white. It's hard to tell, it kind of changes. And then a face kind of in the middle of the blinds there. So in the bottom lower corner, the left corner, it kind of looks like the silhouette of a woman. And if you look closely, it almost looks like she's got about 2 or 3 inches past shoulder length hair. Patterson Homestead. This was built by Colonel Robert Patterson, and one of the most common sightings is a man in military uniform. Usually he's seen from about the waist down, wearing riding boots. They believe it to be Colonel Robert Patterson or possibly Stu Patterson. There's a smell of dinner cooking. This kitchen has not been used in years. I think they may have even removed some appliances just to make room. I don't remember which ones they have because it's been a long time. But, with that being said, people still think they smell food cooking on the stove, even though it's not even a functioning kitchen anymore. There's the sound of children laughing. Many people have said they see this one rocking chair moving, and it's a rocking chair, that many of the Pattersons have used, sat in, whatever. Some people have even said that they've seen a woman rocking a child in this chair. When I gave this talk about a year ago, someone came up to me afterward, and she worked for the Historical Society, and they were putting on a big production at the homestead. Costumes, volunteers, people everywhere. It was a big affair. She came in carrying a giant platter of food and asked, where do I need to put this? And one of the volunteers was in his full military gear, and he just looked at her and walked off. And she's like, fine, I'll figure it out myself. And she goes to put it down, and that's when she realized none of the volunteers were there yet. She had smarted off to Colonel Robert Patterson. Well, he didn't say anything. Woodland Cemetery, one of the most popular, well-known is The Boy and His Dog. I can tell you from looking at the back of my cover, many people recognize this picture right away. So Johnny Morehouse was a 4-year-old boy who drowned in front of his parents' house. They lived right along the canal. Unfortunately, Johnny died about 2 weeks before his 5th birthday. Many, many, many stories have come up where people believe that the dog jumped in an attempt to save him, or that the dog sat by his grave. Family friends of the Morehouse family have actually confirmed that it was just, he loved that dog so much that they just built this monument kind of as a tribute. And they say if you put your hand up to the dog's nose, you'll feel cold air as if the dog's breathing on you. There's a story of a glowing tombstone. So the Mary Crest Hall, which is like right along the edge of the cemetery from UD, people have claimed to see a glowing tombstone at night. Nobody knows which one though. And then some people say they've seen a crying girl sitting on that tombstone, and then other accounts say that she was seen elsewhere in there. But the description is almost always white shoes, jeans, a red shirt, and a blue sweatshirt tied around her waist. And she's crying so much that she can't respond to anything you say. She doesn't answer any questions. There's a story where 3 frat boys were walking home from a party through Woodland Cemetery, and this was before it was completely fenced off, so it's been a while. They see a young girl crying and sitting in front of a mausoleum. She fits that description mostly. And so they stop and they ask her, "Are you okay? Do you need help? Do you want us to walk you home?" And without a word, she just stands up, puts her arms out, and floats backwards into the mausoleum. Those boys never cut through the cemetery again. So Wright Pat Air Force Museum. Now this is a very, very interesting place. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's so much history. There's so much to see there. It's got 1 million square feet. So, you might want to plan to go 2 or 3 times to be able to see everything, unless you're very, very adventurous. But the Strawberry Bitch is one of the most haunted. It's the only one where someone claims they have been slapped. It was a janitor, and he was cleaning around there, and then he claims someone had hit him, I guess when maybe he got too close. But this was a very busy plane. As you can see, it ran 59 missions in 9 months. So less than a year, and it was moving. Some people say if you look at that little bubble on top, they've seen mysterious lights inside the cockpit in front of that, and then they've seen those guns right there moving, as if someone's in there trying to aim or maybe just play. This isn't exactly something that people can just walk over and climb into. And then there's the boxcar. That was another World War II plane. It was named for the pilot Frederick Bach. A different pilot flew it at the time when this happened, but this dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. People have reported hearing, what sounds like a kid running around. There's been reports of seeing a young boy who appears to be Japanese running near the plane. I talked to a woman 2 days ago at the Halloween festival, who said that she actually has a picture. She couldn't find it, but it looks like there was a little boy sitting inside the plane. Again, Wright-Patterson. The Black Maria. This is one of my favorite aircraft to see. It's a helicopter. Originally, it was a dark green color. It was nicknamed the Grasshopper 2, but then they painted it black. I actually read the account of the man who painted this, and he said it was an extremely hot day. He was very mad at his command for doing so, for telling him to paint it that day. But he had to paint it kind of this matte black you see, so it wouldn't reflect light, so it wasn't a shiny color. There's no visual sightings reported with this, but it's an overall sadness and fear, kind of a trepidation. The back part of it's usually open, and if you go back there and you look in, and it just looks like any other aircraft visually, but there's a very strong, heavy feeling there. This was a helicopter that flew classified missions. It went to rescue people. People didn't know if they were going to live as they were sitting inside of this. So they think it just left such an emotional impression. Now, the Lady Be Good, there is no picture because the Lady Be Good has not been whole in a very long time. So this plane did not crash, but it did have to do an emergency landing in the Libyan desert. Basically, with very bad visuals that day, they overshot the Air Force Base, and they ran out of gas. So they landed, hopefully, hoping that they would be rescued. And unfortunately, they weren't rescued. They didn't find this plane for over a decade. So of the crew on it, 6 of them died just kind of waiting around the crash site, hoping to be rescued. One of them just went off and walked and ended up walking 79, before they collapsed, and they were found right there. Another one walked off into the desert and just their footprints vanished, and there were no signs of them in any direction. The odd thing about it was the amount of time these gentlemen were expected to live, they lived twice as long. And nobody can explain why. So they take the Lady Be Good once they find it, and they just disassemble it, and they're going to use it for parts for other planes. It's very common in aviation because the parts are extremely expensive. Every plane, every aircraft that got a piece of the Lady Be Good ended up with catastrophic failure, meaning they either had to do an emergency landing or they crashed. One particular aircraft crashed into the ocean, and the plane and crew was never found. A few pieces of wreckage washed up on shore, and when they checked them all out, they were all pieces from the Lady Be Good. Now, Frankenstein's Castle. I talked about this too with somebody. This is in Kettering. It's just off of Dorothy. It's on Patterson. Peggy Harmison and her boyfriend were in the tower when it was struck by lightning. It was a freak accident. It's the only known death in this tower. And people believe that she's still haunting the place. People have claimed to see her or see something. There's a lot of urban legend associated with this place. Construction on it actually started in 1940. They were just using salvaged supplies from buildings downtown. So it's not as old as many people think. Victoria Theater. The biggest story about Victoria Theater is the actress that's been nicknamed Vicky because they don't know her real name. So she disappeared between scenes. She went upstairs to change her clothes in her dressing room. As she was coming back down, she realized, I forgot my fan. And she commented this to an actor that was on the staircase going the opposite direction. She turned and ran upstairs to go grab it, and she was never seen again. The only way to get out of the building from her dressing room would have either been out one of these windows, as you can see, that's not really an option, or down that staircase again. And there's a security guard sitting in the staircase, and he never saw her that night again. Ever since, though, people have heard footsteps walking across the stage, and there's actually some footage that WDTN has where they went to check this out, and they got footage, and you could hear it. The scent of rose perfume. A lot of people who have been there for an extended period of time have talked about this rose perfume. They don't use her dressing room anymore because people think when they look in the dressing room mirror, they think the room is on fire behind them. But when they turn around, it looks fine. That dressing room door also won't stay shut. And along with the footsteps, people think they hear the sound of her dress, like the gatherings in her dress, rustling. There's also the story of Lucille. Now, Lucille was a young girl, and she went into the theater just to watch a play. She had a chaperone. The chaperone was lured away. Somehow they tricked the chaperone into walking away, and they thought Lucy would be okay for a minute. While she was unattended, a man snuck into her theater box and tried to assault her. Luckily, there were people around who heard her screams, and they intervened, got this man, got him arrested, got him away. Lucille lived a long life. She lived to be an old woman. She moved out of Dayton, but they think the impression of the assault was so intense that it still stays in that box. So there have been men who go into this box, and if they're nice men, nothing happens to them. But if they have a bad temperament, if they're kind of sexist towards women, it's said that they get slapped, kicked, scratched, punched. So if you're going on a first date and you want to know if a guy's a good guy, take him here, let Lucille decide for you. And for more ghosts and legends, you can get my book. Also, I do have another book coming out, and it'll be about Bessie Little. So her full story will be in a book available on March 4th.